Okay, welcome everyone to another hotspot webinar. We are recording this series. So Shannon, are you there?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay, let's get started.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Okay, welcome everyone to the on-call pay, reporting time pay, and other pay issues webinar. And presented today by myself, Audrianne Adams-Lee from HR Network, and Shannon Jenkins. Hello, Shannon.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay, today's topic is a challenging one, and we have had lots of questions around this issue for people who may have pay issues for on-call, reporting time, and other similar pay issues. What we are going to do today, we're not going to take questions today. We actually have quite a few Q&As in the presentation. But if you have a specific question to your company and your pay practices, then we would ask you to email them to either Shannon or I, and we'll answer them directly. So let's get started. Okay, it's important to know who enforces wage and hour issues as we kind of work through this, because who are the people who are overseeing these laws that we're talking about. On the federal side, wage enforcement is done by the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, and it is enforced by the Department of Labor, the DOL. In California, we have our own version of that called the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement, DLSE, and they oversee wage claims, they investigate discrimination in pay practices, and enforce labor laws and your industrial commission wage order. One thing to note is that hours worked, that is overseen by the wage orders, broadly defined as hours worked at the time that an employee is subject to the control of the employer. That line is very important because we're going to be utilizing that term as we look at some of these alternative pay practices. When is the employee actually subject to control of the employer? And it includes all time the employee is suffered and permitted to work, whether required to do so or not. And the number of hours worked is first the most important analysis when we determine if there's been any violations of minimum wage laws or overtime laws. And if you are not sure of what your industrial wage order number is that you are to abide by, because every business, every industry in California falls under one of the 17 industrial wage orders, please contact us. We'll be glad to let you know which wage order applies to you and even send you a copy of your wage order. Okay, key factor. When we talk about on-call, we're really looking at two things. Is the employee waiting to be engaged, sitting around waiting, or is the employee actually engaged to wait for the call? One, it makes a big difference because one is considered unpaid generally, and one is considered to be paid generally. We'll get into that more, but it's important for you to know we're looking at, if you were to call us and say, I'm not sure if I need to pay this on-call time, we're going to specifically look at, is the employee just waiting to be engaged, or is that employee actively engaged to wait for the call? Yeah. It really follows, the standby time is generally, is the time controlled or uncontrolled? So controlled, the definition of controlled is an employee's time is so restricted that they cannot pursue personal activities and come and go as they please. The employer is considered to have direction and control of the employee. Versus uncontrolled is where an employee has a choice of being available or not available to respond to a request by the employee to return to work for an emergency, which may be uncontrolled standby if the employee is completely unrestricted to use the time for his or her own purposes.
So Audrianne, did you want to give the example of that recent situation we had with a residential apartment manager?
Absolutely. So let's talk about that example. We had an apartment management complex where they had several people who during the day work as mechanical type jobs for the apartment complex, and at night they're on call and should any of the residents have any issues. So and in this case, there's a number of people who are available. And so the manager of the apartment complex might get the call and call one of the mechanics and say, are you available to come in? And that employee has the right to say yes or no, I can come in. If not, he'll call on the next employee who has the right to say yes or no, I can come in. Ultimately, if he can't find anyone, the manager will have to do it. But that's uncontrolled standby time because the employee can say yes or no to being responsive. They may be available, may not. They may be in the area, they may not be. They can use the time for whatever they want. But they do know that they are on call and have to take the call as it comes in. Then they choose if they can accept the call or not. Versus uncontrolled standby, if I were to tell that employee instead, I need you to stay in the complex, be available to respond within 10 minutes to any employee's call, and you don't have an option to accept the call or not, that would be controlled time, and it would be subject to be paid. Okay. On call when you're away from the employer's place of business. So this is the test that both the federal and the California Labor Board look at to determine if somebody is subject to the control of the employer. They decide whether there was an on-premise living arrangement, whether there's excessive geographical restrictions on the employee's movements. In other words, you have to stay within 10 miles of the office or the facility so that you can respond in a certain time. Whether the frequency of calls was unduly restrictive. If somebody's on call and they're somewhat free to go about what they want to do, but they get called every 15 minutes or every half hour, and they have to respond to those calls, they're suddenly getting much more restrictive about their ability to take their time and do what they want with it. Whether there's a fixed time limit for a response that's unduly restrictive, whether the on-call employee could easily trade on-call responsibilities. I'm not available. Joe's going to take my place tonight. Whether the use of a pager or cell phone could ease the restrictions. In other words, yeah, if you can just respond to them by phone, the phone call will be less than a minute long. That's not unduly restrictive. And whether the employee had actually engaged in personal activities during their on-call time. Okay, on-call at the employer's place of business. So an employee who is required to remain at the employer's place of business must be paid for that standby time, commonly referred to as waiting time. This includes a restaurant server, for example, who's asked not to clock in until there are sufficient customers, or a seamstress who's waiting for the customer to arrive with an item requiring alterations, or the technical support guy who is waiting for a call from a disturbed person who has spent the last few hours screaming at their computer, and so on. So the idea of, even though an employee might not actually be working, but they're standing by waiting for the work at the employer's place of business, has to be paid. Okay, so Section 5 of the wage order for work performed while on call. This is specifically pulled from the wage order, and it talks about how on-call is paid. So each workday, employee is required to report to work and does report but not put to work. They have to be furnished with half that employee's usual or scheduled day's work, no less than 2 hours, no more than 4 hours, and no less than minimum wage. So for example, if an employee reports to work and they were scheduled for 8 hours, and after 15 minutes, we don't have enough work to put them to work all day and decide to send them home, we will have to pay them at least half of whatever they were scheduled. In this case, they were scheduled for 8. They'd have to be paid at least 4 hours for the day. Okay, if an employee is required to report to work for a second time on any workday and furnish less than 2 hours for the second reporting, that employee shall be paid for 2 hours at the regular rate of pay, which shall not be less than minimum wage. So in my example of the employees on call at the apartment complex, if they were called and actually had to come and handle a call from a tenant, and they had already worked all day for 8 hours, and they came and went on a call. The call took 30 minutes. That employee would actually have to be paid 2 hours for reporting to a second time in a workday, even though they had already worked all day. So they're going to get 2 hours of on-call pay plus the resulting overtime pay added to their hours worked for the day. Okay, reporting time pay or on-call pay is not applicable when the operations can't commence or continue to do threats to employees or property, or when they're recommended by civil authorities. In other words, the police say do not continue. The public utilities fail, or there's any kind of failure in electricity, water, or gas, or the interruption of work is caused by an act of God or other cause not within the employer's control. So what do we consider act of God? Earthquakes, floods, fires, etc. And this section does not apply to an employee who, on paid standby, who is called to perform work at a time other than the employee's scheduled reporting. So in other words, if the employee is already being paid, there's not, for the paid standby, there's not this minimum reporting or pay requirement of 2 hours to no more than 4 hours. Okay, so let's see if you understand what these might be. The first one, a hospital biomedical repair technician was required to respond to all calls, responded to an average of 4 to 5 calls a week, was on call by a beeper, had to respond to within 20 minutes, and could not be intoxicated if called. Okay, what do you think? Do you think it's controlled or uncontrolled? This is actually considered uncontrolled. It was only 4 to 5 calls that he took per week. 20 minutes is not so unrestrictive that someone couldn't make it to a location. And generally we require employees not to be intoxicated if called.
Audrianne, let me just jump in for just a second. So the time that he spent waiting to be engaged versus engaged to wait, that was uncontrolled and that was unpaid. But what about the time that he spent responding to those calls?
That would be paid time, absolutely.
Paid time, right, okay.
Detectives on call during meal breaks were required to remain sober and respond via beeper within 20 minutes. So this one's kind of interesting. They're on their meal period, and if they got a call during their meal period, so it's uncontrolled, they're on their meal period. However, if they got called, a couple interesting things happen here. They would miss their meal period, they would be eligible for the meal period premium, and then any time worked would be paid as well. Okay, an ambulance dispatcher on call was allowed to visit friends, entertain guests, sleep, watch TV, do laundry, and babysit. Uncontrolled, there's no, this person is obviously free to go about and do whatever they need to do, and so that would be considered uncontrolled time as well. A K-9 officer required to carry a pager, avoid alcohol, and respond within 10 minutes. I would consider this potentially to be controlled time because the response within 10 minutes is rather restrictive, in addition to avoiding alcohol. So again, the more restrictive we are, then the more likely it is considered control time and has to be paid. Okay, while the DLSE and case law have attempted to spell out on-call time, remember it is merely a guide to employers. And I can tell you, Shannon and I often have to look at when a client asks us, is this paid or not paid? We have to really we have to look at the facts, so it's very fact intensive. We look at each case based on the facts of that case. We look at the DLSE guidelines, and then at the end of the day, we just try to use common sense about it. Shannon, what would you say if you were defending or helping a client with a case where they may have gotten an issue of compensability for on-call? What are the things that you would look at from a legal perspective?
Well, the first place I would start is the job description, and that would define the essential elements of the job, the essential functions of the job, and it's going to really frame what the position responsibilities are. And if one of those responsibilities is remaining on call or on paid standby time, I think that would set a pretty good foundation for that being controlled time. If the job description is devoid of any reference to remaining available to the employer, then I think that would give the employer an argument that the time was actually uncontrolled. But then we would next look to what were the actual circumstances of the job, irrespective of what the job description says. So we would want to interview people. We would want to visit the work site and gather whatever data or information that you have to show that work time was in fact uncontrolled. So it's really basically looking at the documents and the evidence, and keep in mind that a lot of our forensic work in that regard focuses on electronic documents. You can have somebody who works remotely, and this is especially of a concern with a telecommuting arrangement or where you have field employees and you don't have eyeballs on them at all times, is if you have a regular business end of the day at 5 p.m., but the electronic evidentiary record shows multiple calls and emails being responded to, as late as 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, it's very easy for the employee to say, hey, I worked the entire time, see? And so you have to be very careful about your evidence gathering and your policies when it regards people, especially who don't work physically on your premises.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on. This is really a kind of a repeat, but a reminder of the rule that, again, reporting time pay is for any time an employee reports to work but isn't given the entire day's worth of work to do, then they have to be paid at least half of their scheduled day, no less than 2 hours, no more than 4. So I've had people say to me, well, I sent them home, they were scheduled for 8, but I sent them home after 5 hours. Do I still have to do this? No, as long as that employee worked at least half their scheduled hours, you don't have to pay them for any additional reporting time pay. And again, if the employee reports for a second time, you do have to pay them at least 2 hours for that second as reporting time pay, plus any overtime earned when you add on the time to their regular day. Okay. Actually, I think this is just a repeat of what we just said, so we'll go to the next slide. So again, we gave you exceptions on the employer side, but there's also exceptions at the bottom of this slide for the employee. So if the employee is not fit to work, then you do not have, in other words, there's a medical issue, they appear to have to be intoxicated, some reason that they're not fit for work, you do not, and you have to send them home, you don't have to pay for reporting time pay. or the employee has not reported to work on time and is fired or sent home as disciplinary action. So again, you don't have to pay reporting time pay if the employee is the one who didn't, in other words, they showed up late, now it's too late to put them on the project that was going to be worked on that day, you send them home, you wouldn't owe them any reporting time pay for that day. Okay, so we're going to do some Q&As on reporting time pay. Yesterday, I reported to work on time and was sent home after only 1 hour because there wasn't sufficient work for the entire day. Consequently, I didn't work my full 6-hour shift. How much reporting time am I entitled to? And hopefully, you've thought of your answer. And if your answer is correct, it is, let's go back. The answer is that you would pay this person at least half their scheduled work, which in this case, they were scheduled for 6 hours, so you'd pay them for 3 hours of pay. Okay, next one. Today I reported to work at my scheduled start time, and after working 1 hour of my regular 8-hour shift, the employer sent me home because of lack of work. A few hours later, my employer called and said things had picked up and asked me to report again that day. I did, and then worked an 8-hour shift. Am I entitled to additional pay? And the answer, so think about your answer. Maybe jot it down. What do you think the answer is? And the answer is yes, they would be eligible for additional pay. Under the law, the employee who reports to work on time but is sent home for lack of work is going to be entitled to half their scheduled work. In this case, he would have been eligible for 4 hours of reporting time pay, but then later called back and worked 8 hours. So in this case, total compensation for the day is 11 hours, and one of those hours would be reporting time pay. Would be overtime. So how does that work? 8 hours at regular rate, 1 hour worked for the first time reporting to work, plus the first 7 hours worked the second time later in the day, and 1 hour of overtime. So in this case, you call that person back, you're paying them in addition to the reporting time pay that they got for the first part of showing up for work, but not getting a full shift. Okay, next one. Yesterday, after reporting to work on time and working 3 hours of my usual 8-hour shift, my employer sent me home claiming that my performance was unsatisfactory and I was not doing the job correctly. Am I entitled to reporting time pay? So based on what we've learned today, what do you think the answer is? The answer is yes. The employee is entitled to 1 hour reporting time pay in addition to 3 hours of wages for the work performed. So in other words, in their 8-hour shift, they have to get paid for at least half. They work 3. So their reporting time pay would be 1 hour to complete the 4 hours of work. Okay, next. Today I reported to work as scheduled and was sent home after 1 hour because of a bomb threat in the building. The building closed for the entire day, and I was unable to work my regular 8-hour shift. Am I entitled to reporting time pay? So, what do you think the answer is? The answer is no. This is one of those exceptions that the workday was interrupted due to a threat to employees or property. So based on that situation, the employer would not owe any reporting time pay to the employees that were sent home. Okay, next. Yesterday, I reported to work at my regular time and there was no work available. I was sent home and told to report for the second shift, which I did. I worked 8 hours on the second shift. For the day, my employer paid me 12 hours of regular pay. Since I was paid for 12 hours, shouldn't 4 of these hours be at the overtime rate instead of the regular rate? And that would be a common question an employee in this situation might give you. But the answer is no, the employee was paid correctly. Reporting time pay is in the nature of a penalty against the employer for expecting to work so many hours in a day. So reporting time pay is a penalty, therefore it does not get counted as time worked to determining hours worked for overtime purposes. It's just like the meal period penalty. Any penalties that you pay are not considered time worked and don't get added in for the purposes of determining overtime. Okay, next. 2 days ago, I reported to work on time for my regular 8-hour shift. I worked for 3 hours, then went home to take care of my sick child. Am I entitled to any reporting time pay because I didn't work half my usual day? So, what do you think the answer is? The answer is no, because the employee left of their own volition to attend a personal matter, so they're not entitled to any reporting time pay. In this situation, the employer didn't deprive the employee of the opportunity to work their full schedule. It was the employee's choice, so no reporting time pay is due. Okay, next. Yesterday, my regular 8-hour work shift ended at 3:30. I was required to report back at 5:30 on the same workday to attend a 1-hour training meeting. I am paid $10 an hour. Am I entitled to any reporting pay? So what do you think the answer is? The answer is yes, you are entitled to 1 hour of 1 hour reporting time pay. Remember, if you report back to work on a second time and any one day, you are eligible for at least 2 hours of reporting time pay. So in this case, the employee attended a 1-hour training meeting, therefore they would be still eligible for another 1 hour of reporting time pay. Also, by the way, that 1 hour would be counted as overtime because they worked a full 8-hour shift in the prior in the day. Okay, call back pay. So I want to just go over this one more time. What happens if an employee is called back to work after completing a shift? And that is that the California wage order does call that the callback provision. So again, if an employee reports to work a second time in any scheduled work day and is furnished less than 2 hours, they must be paid for 2 hours at his or her regular rate of pay. Okay, one thing that can happen when you have people who are on call is they may be required to travel, either travel back to the work site and or travel back again in a second time in a day, or travel to a client site, or wherever they may be on call. So so you may owe travel time as well, in addition to any hours worked, any on-call pay, any reporting time pay. So you have to kind of think about, is there travel time involved? And if so, it is considered compensable work. So hours where the employer requires its employees to meet at a designated place and or use the employer's designated transportation to or from a work site would be considered travel time pay that may be owed. And again, if I'm on call and I get called and then my employer says, I need you to go over to our client at this address, the clock actually starts ticking when the employee leaves to travel to that address. Now, if you pay travel time at a different rate of pay than their regular time, they might end up with rates of pay or rates for that day on 2 different rates of pay, one for travel time, one for regular work. But you do have to account for travel time pay if the employee has to travel to a site.
Audrianne, I think this is a good point to remind everybody of the lesson from the Lobo case, which is that if you have an employee who regularly travels, and that's going to show up on their pay records because travel time is compensated, if they travel as part of their job, then even if they may be traveling in off-business hours or off-work hours, there is an argument that they are still under the control of the employer because traveling is part of their job. So very important that the employees that you select and permit to allow to travel are kept as minimal as possible to keep as low as possible that exposure on the finding of an employer relationship during the off-duty hours.
Okay, great. All right, so I want to recap one more time, and actually I'm going to recap what we spoke about. We talked about 3 specific reporting type or pays that can occur when an employee is on call or reports to workers called back. So again, on-call pay, the pay is determined whether how controlled the employee is under the care of the employer. The more restrictive you are about how the employee can go about his or her own business, restrictive by how soon they have to respond, how close they have to be, if they have to make sure not be intoxicated, if they have to take so many calls, be willing to take so many calls, and if it's not an option to take those calls, then it's likely that the on-call pay would have to be paid. In other words, they would be engaged to wait rather than waiting to engage. Reporting time pay, if an employee reports to work and you send them home and they work less than their regular schedule, they have to be paid at least half of whatever that regular schedule was, a minimum of 2 hours, a maximum of 4 hours. And then callback pay. Anytime an employee is called back to work after working a regular shift, they have to be paid at least 2 hours. Anything you want to add here, Shannon, as kind of part of our recap and wrap-up?
No, I would only remind everybody that if for some reason you missed a portion of the presentation or want to view it or have others view it because you think it's valuable, it certainly will be available on our website. And Audrianne, I don't know if it's also available on yours, but I'm sure you can push out the PowerPoint. Okay, perfect. Then go ahead and revisit it. This is a really important area of concern, and we want to make sure that you have not only the depth and the breadth of the knowledge regarding these particular discrete pay issues, but that you have an open line of communication to your payroll vendor so that that vendor is accurately recording and paying on this time for you.
Okay, so as I said, we are taking questions today only because questions usually are very company specific, and we feel like it's best if we just answer those one-on-one. So if you have a question, please feel free to email us, either Shannon or myself, and we'll see you next month. We have a hotspot scheduled in June. I don't know if I recall. Do you recall off the top of your head, Shannon, what the topic is?
No.
I don't either, but I'm sure it will be exciting. And then also just to let everyone know, we are planning to, we don't have a date yet, but we will have it out shortly. We are planning a mid-year legal update in August. We started last year doing the mid-year legal updates and found it to be pretty valuable. So we will be letting everyone know when that is, sometime probably mid to late August. Okay, that wraps it up for now. We thank everyone for attending and hope to have you back next month.